Exactly. Okay. Special dedication, sponsorship of today's shir in honor of the Chassan and Kala. I don't know all their Hebrew names. Sarit and Yosef, but I don't know their the full Hebrew names. But should be zochet to build a bias nemet b'Yisrael, have a happy and healthy marriage. You should have nachas from them and all of your children. Terrific, special. So thank you for sponsoring. Thank you everybody for coming. Great to be back together, both in person and virtually. So today we are meeting a father-son duo. Another Father's Day. Oh, the Rebbeinu Shalom runs the world in such amazing ways. I'm telling you, it's hashgacha. That's right. I didn't even realize the Rebbeinu Shalom runs the world in funny ways. It's the first and only father-son duo in the letters to Ben Gurion. And the other thing which is interesting and hashgacha is that the theme of their letters begins and focuses in yesterday's Haftorah. So before we get to that, let's start where this father-son duo is focused.
One letter written by
two letters. Ben
Ben
Gurion addressed two letters to this father-son duo, which I will introduce you to both of them. In the Hebrew edition, the old school edition, it's on there. One is on page 30, and the other one is on 36. I'll explain to you a little bit more.
They're written how far apart?
One of them is written on the 18th of December. I'm sorry, the 14th of December, and the other one is Hey Teves, so probably a couple weeks.
So the same year.
Of course, they're both responding to Ben Gurion's letter within a couple weeks of each other.
Did they know that they?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if they both were aware that the other one received the inquiry from Ben Gurion. We're going to start today. We're going to visit a very interesting place, a makom, that the Rebbeinu Shalom has chosen to be a very, very fascinating study, which we're just going to mention in a cursory way today. But we're going to begin in a city. It's called Livorno. We're going to talk about Italy. Livorno, or I think in English it's also pronounced or written Leghorn or Lehorn. It's a city. It's a city in Italian. It's called Livorno. Livorno, exactly. It's also in Halacha. It actually became a very important city for printing. We'll talk about it in a second. But Livorno, it's referred to in Hebrew as Livorno, not Leghorn. But it's a city, a port city on the western edge of Tuscany, which beginning in the 16th century became a major port city and a significant Jewish community. Barbanel started in Spain, maybe.
Somebody else that you mentioned.
Ramchal? Ramchal? Did Ramchal spend any time in Livorno? Maybe. A lot of people spent time. I don't know. That's an interesting question. I don't remember if Ramchal. No, Ramchal was in Italy. He was in Italy. So in 1650, they established a printing house in Livorno, which is very significant. Think about 1650. You're talking one of the first printing houses, and a lot of, I could show you on the computer, a lot of old Sfarim. If you look on the Sharblatt, on the cover page, the title page, it says on the bottom, Livorno. Many of these Sfarim were printed there. And this father-son duo that we're going to focus on today are very much focused on this city of Livorno. The father of the duo that we're going to talk about was the rabbi of Livorno. He was also born in Livorno. And the son was born in Livorno, and he was the last rabbi to be ordained by the rabbinical school in Livorno. The names of these rabbis, of these two great individuals, the father is Rav Shabsai Toaf. I apologize for the mispronunciations today. Shabsai Toaf. His Italian name was Alfredo. So it's Shabsai Aleph Toaf, Alfredo Shabsai Toaf, Professor Dr. Harav Shabsai Alfredo Toaf. And his son, the other letter is Elio, which is an interesting name. I don't know if that's short for Eliyahu, but his name was Elio Raffaello Toaf. Father, son, rabbis Toaf. The elder Rabbi Toaf was born in 1880 in Livorno. He received smicha in 1903, and he was the rabbi of Livorno from the end of April in 1924 until 1963. He was one of the senior chashivster rabbanim in Italy. He was the president of the Assembly of Rabbis of Italy. He was the director of the yeshiva in Livorno from 1924 to 1955. He died in Livorno in 1963. His son, Rav Elio Toaf, was born in 1915. He went to yeshiva in Livorno, and he also had a secular education. So this is interesting because the fact that both the father and the son, Rabbis Toaf, were both Torah educated and secularly educated was not uncommon in the Italian milieu if you look back over centuries. Because on the one hand, there were definitely periods of significant challenge in Italy. There were periods of severe persecution. So for example, if you look at, let's say, the 16th century, the 16th century saw the first ever ghetto established in Europe. The word ghetto is Italian. Ghetto, which there's a question of the exact origin of this, but we'll assume for the moment that the word ghetto comes from the word ghetto, which means foundry. And Venice, the Venetian ghetto, was the first ghetto ever established, where Jews were required to be locked in. In 1553, it's almost the 3 weeks, Rahman al-Islam, we're going to think about this on Tisha B'Av. In 1553, a famous or infamous episode took place in Rome with, anybody know what happened in 1553 in Rome? The burning of all of the copies of the Talmud. And there's actually, I saw a picture of this. I've never been to Rome, but I saw a picture of a monument that stands in Rome today, a monument to this event of the burning of the Talmud in Rome. They spent 9 days searching and confiscating all the copies of the Talmud. And in 1553, that meant that all the copies were handwritten. Those are irreplaceable documents. You can't just print another copy of the Shas like that.
Look in their basement.
What's that? So they didn't have, it was burned, you see, they had to hide them, but they were burned, all the copies of the Talmud. So there's a picture today you can see online of the monument to this event, and it includes a reference to a poem. Do you recognize the words? Sha'ali Srufa Ba'esh. Guess where's that poem? When do we say that poem? That's right. It's a kina on Tisha B'Av that predates this. This is the kina that Rav Meir Rothenberg wrote for the burning of the Talmud in France in 1242.
Did he take it from?
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. So there were periods of intense persecution, but at the same time, it's interesting that there were periods of unique openness and integration where there were many rabbis who were also secularly educated. So one of those, for example, was the Sforno. Rav Ovadia Sforno, famous Chumash commentator, famous rabbi, important Torah leader. He also went to university. He had a medical degree. He studied all kinds of secular subjects. One of probably the most important and famous Rav Posik, Rav Muvak, in the history of Italian Jewry in a halachic context was known as the Maharik, Rav Yaakov Kolon in the 15th century. The Maharik has an interesting tshuva, the Maharik, where he discusses the following shaila. Are Jewish doctors, are they allowed to wear what is it called? Lab coats. There's a word for that. What's it called? What are they? They're like, no, but there's a name for it, isn't there? Like a lavush? No, isn't there a special name for that? The doctor, when they come in the office and they have that, not scrubs, like a coat.
Oh, coat.
It's a lab coat, but I think in Italian there was a special name for it. So, right, there was a chashuv, there was a name. Whatever it was. Why is this a shiloh? Why is this a shiloh? Because we know there is such an Isser on the books. The Torah tells us that you're not allowed to follow in the ways of idolaters. You're not allowed to practice or act in a way that mimics non-Jews, Gentiles. So in those days, you had Gentiles. They wore lab coats, the doctors. They wore doctors' coats, and they had a very distinct look. So the Maharik was asked, are Jews allowed to wear these same lab coats as their non-Jewish colleagues? So the Shiloh itself, what's it?
The only thing is they sometimes call it a white.
A white coat, yeah. So I remember when the Chama graduated from dental school, they had a white coat ceremony where they gave them the coats. So this Shiloh, the Maharik, has a lot of implications. But what does it tell me that was going on in those days? That Jews were going to medical school. Jews were getting recognized and jobs in the field of medicine, and they were practicing like Gentiles. They were not restricted from this. There were times in Italy where this was restricted, but if you went to France, in most periods, Jews couldn't hold most jobs. That's why they ended up in money lending, because they couldn't own land, they couldn't go into guilds, they had so many restrictions. But in many cases, in many of these Italian provinces, Jews could hold regular jobs. So they were integrated in a large way into society. And that's what you're seeing here in the 20th century. This father-son rabbinic duo were also a father-son secularly educated duo. The younger son, the Rabbi Raffaello Toaf, he went to law school. He got a law degree. His father had a PhD. They were secular educated. So it's interesting about think about all the different personalities that we've met in the 20th century. Their relationship to the general society was very interesting. It's also interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
When I grew up and was learning stuff, we were always told that to be in a ghetto, like in Venice in the 1600s or so, was the worst thing for the Jews. So later on, Rabbi Dr. David Ruderman from the University of Pennsylvania put together a whole series, and he tries to show that living in the ghetto in Venice was the best thing that happened to the Jews.
Interesting.
Because they were locked in, but the gates opened at 6 o'clock at night, if I remember. And the interchange between the Jews in the ghetto and the intelligent non-Jews outside the ghetto was what brought all those Jews to medical school.
Interesting.
And they became all the professors in the University of Modena. And he mentions all of those places. And he put the ghetto at that point in time into a very positive
Interesting.
experience.
Okay, that's
and
cool.
That's what exploded Jewish culture and life in Italy thereafter.
So if you couldn't hear it online, I don't know if you could, but when Mrs. Poland was saying that she heard an interesting series of lecture that looks at the sociological effects of the ghetto in terms of the intelligentsia and the interplay between them, that it was open in the daytime, was closed at night. That's interesting. It's obviously much more knowledgeable than I am. I'm not Italian. I'm not a historian, certainly not of Italian Jewish history. And there's a lot written about this. But just parenthetically, this question, the Maharik, has a lot of ramifications. Let's say when Nechama graduated dental school, so I don't remember if I had, when I graduated YU, they also had this. They had all the people walk down in their academic garb. So when Nechama graduated dental school, I remember in the back of the manual, they give out the program, they had the history of academic regalia. They told you, they go through the whole history of it. The robes and the colors and the whole thing. So this is the same Shiloh as the Maharik. Can you wear academic regalia because it's mimicking Oxford and Cambridge and all these places? Can you wear that? So the Maharik's chiddush was, this comes out very Lamaisa. The Maharik says, here's the question. does this have anything to do with idol worship? Or does it have an ulterior motive? What's the ulterior motive? Why does a doctor wear a lab coat? To intimidate the patients. I'm just kidding. Because he wants to show a sense of distinction in his practice. So the Ma'arik says you have to ask two questions. Number one, does it have anything to do with idol worship? If it has anything to do with idol worship, you're out at the plate. You can't get to first base. He says the second question you have to ask yourself is this a Gentile practice which is just culturally Gentile and there's no purpose? If that's the case, you're not allowed to do it. But it's a Gentile practice, but it has a reason. So then you're not doing it just to mimic Gentiles. You're doing it for the same purpose that the Gentiles are doing it. So when the doctor walks into the room, he is doing it for the purpose of demonstrating his authority. Exactly, his position. Exactly. Exactly. So now, same thing with graduation. Why do they have these people wear the Harry Potter get-ups at graduation? Why do they do that? It's not stam shtick. It's because they want to show that this is a very chashuv event. It's a ceremony. It's chashuv. So I remember when I graduated YU, Rabbi Mordechai Willig Shlita, he walked down there. He was wearing the whole Smurf outfit, the hat and the thing. Why did Rabbi Willig wear that? Because it was giving kavod to the graduates, to the ceremony. So this is the rule, by the way. So the Gaon is more machmir, the Vilna Gaon is machmir, but the Ramah Paskins like this Ma'arik. This Ma'arik, this great Ma'arik Kolon, he is very authoritative in later poskim, especially with Ramah and Ashkenazi Jews. Many poskim followed the Ma'arik. We lived in Italy in the 15th century.
One could argue, all this, where does it all date back to? Where does it all go back to?
So you have to look back.
Kohen Gadol.
Okay, maybe it comes to Kohen Gadol. Very good.
What the priests are wearing, and it's all. Yeah.
Good. It changes clothes. Exactly.
Distinction, it's an event.
So exactly. So, but it's interesting to me. Why is this a tshuva the Ma'arik? The answer is because that's where it was Nogea. Because of this, and I'm not oversimplifying all 1,000 years of Italian Jewish history. It's interesting. You'll go in Yerushalayim, Kodesh, if you've ever been, there is a synagogue in downtown Yerushalayim, an Italian synagogue. You can take a tour. There, we have documentation of Italian Jewish communities dating back to the times of the Hashmonaim. But according to, I remember going on this tour, visiting this place, there's a plaque. They have a tradition. I don't know if it's documented. They have a tradition that there were Jews who started settling in Italy from the days of the Churban Bayis Rishon.
Oh, wow.
Think about it.
Maybe
When
it
Jews
makes
were
sense,
being,
Rishon.
yeah, but think about it, even in Barishon, it makes sense. Where's Italy and where's Israel? If you're being, just run over the Mediterranean. You get a boat, you get a couple of Yidden, and you take your boat and you go there. Which is why there are a lot of interesting, very distinct minhagim in Italy.
Yeah.
Minhage Italia, not just their Nusach HaTfilah, they have many other minhagim. I remember when I studied Jewish history, the history of the Rishon with Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik, should live and be well, he was pointing out some of these unusual minhagim, Minhage Italia, that point to the fact that there was a unique, singular relationship between Israel and Italy, the Jewish communities in the two going back millennia, because they're just a boat ride away on the Mediterranean. So it's really interesting to think about how the antiquity, the ancient relationship that Jews have with Italy. It's also complicated because Chazal already in the times of the Gemara talk about Romi and the seat of the Roman Empire. And then in the 4th century, when it becomes the bastion of Christianity, when it becomes the official religion of the Holy Roman Empire. So there's such an interesting, there's so much more to talk about than today, but to realize that when we talk about the responses of rabbis Toaf in the 20th century, we're talking about a history that goes back literally thousands of years. So it goes back very interestingly thousands of years, but it's also interesting to see how over periods of time, there was this interchange, there was an interaction between the Jewish community and the general secular Goyish community that was sometimes very positive. So that's just very interesting. So this father and son team are going to introduced to us an important line of argumentation, which starts actually in yesterday's Haftorah. It begins a little bit in the senior Rabbi Toaf's article, and it's much stronger in the younger Rabbi Toaf's article, who's very, very chazak. Yesterday, we had the story of a great Jewish hero in the days of the Shoftim, and his name is Yiftach. Yiftach HaGiladi. What happened in the Haftorah yesterday? What happened? Remember, Yiftach, the family rejected him, then they had sorrows, so they came back and they found him.
Want him to come back and help him.
Exactly. He was kicked out, and then they're like,
We
You
didn't
know,
really mean it.
episode, we're sorry, it's a misunderstanding, all of a sudden now, shkayach. Okay,
You're a
so he
great
comes back,
general.
great general, awesome. The thing is that not just was Yiftach in terms of his pedigree, not exactly Mio de Ama, Chazal are pretty critical of what happens to him at the end of the story, which is not mentioned in the Haftorah. Because at the end of the Haftorah, he says, if I'm successful, whoever, whatever comes out of my house, that will become Kodesh Lashem, be a korban. What's that? That's right.
I didn't know.
So that becomes such a bizarre, Chazal have a lot to say about this, a bizarre episode where his daughter comes out of the house first. So he ends up, and we don't know exactly what happens, it's not clear in the Mefarshim, he sends her away. Not likely that he actually sacrificed her. Maybe he promised that she would never marry and she would have to live in seclusion and she's broken. But Chazal say, why don't you just go do Ataras Nedarim? Call the Navi, get a Bezdin, call the rabbi, it's Erev Rosh Hashanah, go do Ataras. So the Chazal don't have a very positive view of Yiftach. They don't. And yet, the Pasuk says at the beginning of Parsha Shoftim, sometimes you have a question. You're not sure what to do. The come to Alisa. So you're going to go up to Yerushalayim, to the Beis Hamikdash, to the Sanhedrin, to the Chachamim. Uvaso el HaKohen, asher yeh bayomimai. You go to the Kohen, that will be in those days. Asher yeh bayomimai. So the Medrash, the Sifri, on that pasuk says, I have a question for you. You're going to go to the Beis Hamikdash to ask the chief rabbi of your era. Who do you think you were going to ask? You're going to ask the chief rabbi from last year? You're going to call Rav Moshe Feinstein on the telephone now? What does it mean? You call the person who's in your era.
Does it meaning things change and you gotta, whatever's happening?
Yeah, like Noah at the time.
Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yosef Glili says the Medrash V'chil Dala Al Daitcha, that you're going to go ask somebody who's not living, but rather, Ein Lacha Ela Shofet Shebiyamecha. You only have the rabbinic leadership of your generation. And you have to be okay with that. That's part of life. That's the nature of the changing of the guard. Maybe there's such a thing called Yeridas Hadoros. We're not what we used to be. If the Rishonim, the Gemara is an expression. If the Rishonim were like Malachim, they were like angels, so we were like people. And if the Rishonim, the previous generations, the sages, they were like people, we're like Chamorim, donkeys. And the Gemara says, don't think we're like the Chamor of Pinchas Ben Yair, the Heliger of Pinchas Ben Yair, the Tana, the Tzaddik. We're just Stam average Chamorim, as the Gemara says. The donkeys of our time, exactly. The regular donkeys.
Yeah.
The regular. So it says the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, this topic is brought up in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, Daf Chaf Hei. And right before this same concept that appears in the Sifri, the Gemara has the previous pasuk from Tehillim, where it's talking about different leaders, Yerubal, V'chule, and Yiftach. The Gemara has an expression, this is what you were alluding to. Yiftach b'doro, kishmuel b'doro. Yiftach in his generation of leadership, like Shmuel in his generation of leadership. The same way that if you lived in the generation of Shmuel, you understood he was mamish from the Gedolei Historia, the level of tzidkus of Shmuel. He's from the pantheon of great neshamas that ever came into this world. And Yiftach, the Gemara says, I'm not saying it, the Gemara says he was, the quote is Kal Shebekalim. He was the lightweight. But at the end of the day,
but of a great, lightweight
but
of greatness. Of great
A,
greatness.
lightweight compared to the other ones, and B, in that generation, he was the leader. And so we need to recognize the importance and the influence of the Chachamim of every generation. So this is where rabbis Toaf, so interestingly, I don't know if they communicated about this before, they have a very similar tone in their response to Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion sends the letter to all the 50 intellectuals around the world, rabbis and thinkers and scholars, and who's a Jew? So the elder Rabbi Toaf is a little more deferential, where he says, Rosh Memshalah, you have this great schus to serve the Jewish people and to keep us all united, etc. But he says, Ani moche b'chol tokef. I protest against you, Ben Gurion. Asher panisa l'chol chachmei Yisrael ba'aretz u'bagolah. That you have looked to all the Jewish wisdom, the wise people of Judaism in Israel and beyond. Ki lefi dati, says Rab Shabsai Alfredo Toaf, according to my opinion, Rabbanei b'dinas Yisrael, the rabbis of the state of Israel, musmachim behechlet lachriya halacha. They are empowered and endowed to rule in matters of halacha. And this is, lefi hayigayon, according to logic, Yesod hadati bi'ikaro. This is the fundamentals of Judaism, this issue. Hayu machrim rabbanei Yisrael be'emunah. V'zemaliv ma'od, he says it's a shame, the senior rabbi, Tav, to ignore this. He goes on the rest of the letter about the relationship between Israeli Jews and Chutz La'aretz Jews. But he says, I don't understand, why are you calling me? Why are you asking me? This is a shiloh for the Rabbanim Musmachim in Eretz Yisrael. And the son, Rav Elio Toaf, is even more sharp. He's very sharp.
Much shorter letter.
Yeah, it's a shorter letter, and he gets right to it.
Right to the point.
It's very, very sharp. He says, Kodem Kol, before everything. He doesn't even say, hey, Shalom Aleichem. I just want you to understand. I'll interrupt with just to realize who this man was. Remember, when was he born? He was born in 1915. Where's he living? In Italy.
Oh, yeah. Right before. Right, or right.
He's
Right
born
after.
on the cusp of World War I.
Right before the pandemic, 1970.
So, right before the Spanish flu. He says, in 1941, he becomes the rabbi of a small Italian Jewish community called Ancona. What year is this? 1941. So think about what the backdrop of his life is. The senior and the junior rabbi. Until 1938, who was the government in Italy? The fascist government. Now, it happens to be that there were no anti-Jewish persecutions. There were no anti-Jewish laws until 1938. But in 1938, they start promulgating anti-Jewish laws. In 1941, he becomes the rabbi of Ancona. What happens in 1943? The Italian government falls to the Allies, and they split Italy in half. The bottom half is taken by the Allies, but the top half is immediately invaded and controlled by the Germans. So they start hunting. They start hunting Jews. And I'm reading from a Google Translate of an interview that Rabbi Elio Toaf did. The senior rabbi went into hiding. The younger rabbi, he's the rabbi in 1941. It was an interesting experience, he says. Very formative, at times even hard. At the beginning, the most difficult moments. As soon as I arrived, I learned that a Jewish family was about to convert to Christianity. Listen to this, amazing Maisa. You're under the clouds of war, 1941. Without hesitation, I immediately went to see them for a few hours before the celebration. I told the father that they were about to take a cowardly, useless, and undignified step. This is in Italy, 1941. At first, I was not understood, but it must have been for my enthusiasm, for my sincerity, or for the passion with which I spoke. In the end, no one was converted. On the contrary, the father became the president of the community's humanitarian consultancy. He said, but he went to the hospital to do Bikur Cholim, and you know what happened? He says, 2 Jewish nurses threw him out. 2 nurses threw him out. Why? Because he was Jewish. They wouldn't let him in there. So he went to one of the local Catholics. This is also, I'll just say, al regel achas, zachol hatov, even though the Pope, we could say a lot of controversial things, about whether or not the Pope was decent or not, standing up for the Jews. But you should know, zachol hatov, the Italians, the Catholics, who in many, many instances saved Jews. What happened to Rabbi Toaf in Ancona? He says the arrival of the Nazis forced them to take refuge in Versilia in Val di Castello. And there was a parish priest. His name was Don Francalanci. Don Francalanci. Rabbi Toaf says, quote, he hid us for a long time in his parish. We slept in the church. My father on the steps of the main altar. The rest of us slept on the benches.
Amazing.
He says the following Maisa that happened to him. He was rounded up by the SS. He was captured with a group of others. The rabbi, the young Rabbi Elio. Rabbi Elio was captured with a group of other Jews.
The senior was in the safer.
The senior was in safer. He was not caught. The younger was caught. He said, I was digging my own grave. He was with a group. They were taken out. They were digging their grave by the SS. I accidentally saved myself while I was digging my grave. The others were shot. I, by the order of an Austrian commander with whom I exchanged a few words in French, was saved. Before leaving, I prayed about the bodies of comrades who had not had the same as me. So he's standing at the pit. They're all being shot. He talks to the guy. And the guy says, you can leave. He runs off and he joins the partisans. He describes here, I don't want to read it because it's not for, he describes being part of a group of partisans that found there was a massacre, one of the worst German massacres, not of Jews, of Italian peasants living in a mountain place called Sant'Anna di Stazzema. And he describes what he saw there after the Germans had left, what they had done. Crazy. So after the war, what happens? He becomes the chief rabbi of Venice. Someone asked him after the war, you had contacts. Why didn't you leave Italy? He said, my father told me the rabbi is different than everybody else. He has to stay with this community. He can't just leave. So both the father and the son survived the war. You should know that even though the Germans had control of Rome, before the war, there were less than 50,000 Jews. There were about 10,000 Jews living in Rome. Only about 1,000 of them were deported because many of them were saved by Christians, by Catholics. Zachor Latov, I'll tell you two famous people, two mamish famous people. One was a guy, he was later the conductor of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. What's that? No. The New York Philharmonic Orchestra.
Toscanini.
What's that? Toscanini. What's that? Toscanini. Someone said it. Toscanini. Toscanini was a famous. He was the most famous conductor in all the world. He was famous for not going along with the fascists. He was beat up on the street by a bunch of fascist thugs. When he would play, he would refuse to play the fascist anthem before his symphonies. He went to Israel in the early 1930s, to Palestine, and he established the precursor to the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra. This guy, Toscanini, a guy Gomor. And the other one, not as well known, but you have to understand, this guy at that time, he was like the equivalent of Tom Brady. More than that. Who was the most famous? I guess the guy Ronaldo was the most famous athlete in the world, or Michael Jordan? Michael Jordan in Chicago. I should say Michael Jordan. His name was Gino Bartoli. Gino Bartoli was the most famous cyclist in the world. He won the Italian head of cycling several times. He won the French, the Tour de France a few times, a couple times, Pashit. Do you know that he rode hundreds and thousands of miles around the Italian countryside? In the frame of his bicycle, he kept forged documents.
There's a movie, a documentary.
There is a beautiful documentary about him. It is mamish, incredible. This guy, he was bringing forged documents to Jews who were hiding with Christians in convents and homes, in parishes.
He wasn't Jewish.
No, he's a guy Gomer. He's sitting in Gan Eden, a lichtig in Gan Eden, this guy, this cyclist. Because when the Germans would stop him, he would say, "You can't touch the bicycle. It's very precise. It's a very precise instrument, and it cannot be touched." He would keep it in the pipes of the bike. It's incredible. So it's interesting. Rabbi Toaf survives the war. Both Rabbi Toafs survived the war. Zachal Hatov to these Italians. He becomes afterwards the chief rabbi of Venice for 6 years. He says this too was a beautiful experience.
How old was he then?
Well, let's think. He was born in 1915.
He's so young.
1915. So he's 1915 till 1951. So he's almost right. He's almost 40. And then in 1951, unexpectedly, he became the chief rabbi of Rome. And that's why he's writing this letter from Rome. He's very famous. He died at 99. He was very famous because in 1986, he invited the late Pope John Paul II to the synagogue of Rome.
The
And he
beautiful.
1,000 people came, and this historic event where Pope John Paul came, and they gave a drasha about how Jews and Catholics can live together. You should know that Pope John Paul II, this Polisher guy, he has a will. I read it. You can read the whole will and testament online from the Pope, the late Pope, because all the documents, everything is online. He only mentions 2 people in his Sava, only mentions 2 people by name. One of his secretaries and the rabbi of Rome. It was wild because it was all over the news. You can read now, this Rabbi Toaf, when the Pope came to the shul on Shabbos, he greeted him, but he didn't give him a handshake, he gave him a hug. And everybody was like blown away because that was not the protocol. But he became a symbol, unbelievable symbol of being, when he passed away, there was a letter in the Chasheva documents of the last Pope, the Friedricher Pope, not Francis, what's his name? The last guy, I forget his name, the previous one, when he died, when Rabbi Toaf died, he got a special letter from the Pope recognizing him. Well, it's a posthumous recognition, but he was, imagine this man, Smicha, Livorno, Rome, everything. So what does he say? What does he tell Ben Gurion? And at this point, 1958, he's the chief rabbi of Rome, but he's only 43 years old. But what he's seen and he's done in his lifetime at the age of 43, he could talk sharp, all right? He's Skodem Sol. He says, excuse me, before anything. Yarsheli Kvodo, you will permit me. Limchos, to protest, al, and this is a very unusual Hebrew word, sharuriyah. The word sharuriyah is modern Hebrew for scandal. He says, this is an outrage. It's a scandal. Shelo niyasa kamoa b'divrei yemei Yisrael. That never existed in the history of Jews. He is all in.
This whole question.
He says, Sheshe'ela hilchatit yisodit, that a fundamental halachic question, Tishael, should be asked, Gam me anashim she'en lehem yad v'shem b'hora kedin Torah, of people who have no relationship, no yad v'shem in in Jewish law? V'sheyesh b'soicham, they also have Mechalei Shabbos. You're asking people on Mechalei Shabbos to ask the question of Mi Yehudi?
Everybody
Wow.
does know the whole list. He knows the daddy.
Yes, it must be. Must be. How else would he know? And then he says, it's amazing. He's so harsh. He says to Ben Gurion, and you also call them Shekvodo Karalahem Chachmei Yisrael? This is what you write when you're in your 30s or 40s, right?
Yeah.
The Rabbi Toaf Sr. is like,
More
he
political.
says, I'm not sure. He says, Misupkani. He says, I was a little bit in doubt whether I should even answer you. He says, what's for a shaila? What kind of a question is this? He says, Yesh Rabbanu Tarashit LaEretz Yisrael. They are the Mosara Datiya Elyon Bizmanenu. They are the most senior spiritual, religious institution of our time. They already weighed in on this question. There's nothing to talk about. He's so harsh. He says, I wasn't sure that I should answer your question, but I thought that if I didn't answer, it might be that my silence is as if I am agreeing. Somehow I am in concert with this shaila, and it shouldn't be that I should be kol hamachtias harabim. Anybody who makes the community sin, ein mespikim liyodu lasas tshuva. So I'm going to tell you. He says, ein b'schuta shel memshalat Yisrael, and then he says the same line that his father has. He says that the halacha doesn't recognize any other discussion, distinction, decision. The halacha is the halacha. The state of Israel can write Jew, they can write whatever they want. This is the halacha. He says, he ends with a shtickle comment. He says, allow me, Kvodo, to express my aspiration that you did such an incredible job of establishing the state of Israel. Please, please, do not split the nation and create a chasm between Medinat Yisrael and all of Jews. And he says, he signs it, B'chol HaKavod HaRa'ui, Aleph Reish Toar. Aleph Hey, Ayin Hey is just first Esquire. Elio Raphael Toar. Ein Lecha Ela Shofet Shavim. Wow.
Has anybody ever addressed when Ben Gurion was reading the letter, why did Ben Gurion go outside of it?
Because that's when we started at the beginning, way at the beginning in the introduction, that Ben Gurion wanted everybody to weigh in on this question. This was the origins of the whole debate in the Knesset, and he wasn't satisfied with just the Rabbanut. Yeah, it was all politics. It was all politics. I'll give you two Mar Makomos as we conclude on this last point, which is not the focus of our discussion today, on the idea of a modern centralized authority on Jewish law. We don't have a Sanhedrin, right? The Sanhedrin is the senior rabbinical court, and even though the Rambam's opinion is that the Rambam's shita is that you can reinstate a Sanhedrin, even in our day, you need certain conditions. The Chachmei HaMasorah have to, and we don't have that yet. At the same time, this idea of Shofet Shebiyamecha, the fact that we have Chachamim in our day, so they're not the Sanhedrin. So one article, I would say, these articles are both by Rav Aaron Lichtenstein Zecher out of the Kodesh Levracha in the second volume of Leaves of Faith. The one article is on the place of the chief rabbinate in Israel in a modern state, the halachic, hashkafic significance. That's one article, and that relates to this because Rabbi Toav says, "What are you talking to us for?" There's a chief rabbinate in Israel, so the role of the chief rabbinate, and the second one has to do with the role of I forget the exact lashon. What he talks about in this article is the role of finding chachamim, Baalei Masorah in every generation, with which you connect to establish your outlook on life. It's about, I think the title is something like Modern Orthodoxy and Legitimization, or how you understand that there are different approaches in Yadus today, some which would not agree with these Chachamim who went to university, and some who would agree with them, how to make sure that any serious Ben Torah has a rootedness, has a connection to not just halacha, but baalei halacha. And that we don't just establish our orientation and our values willy-nilly, and that it's rooted in both traditional sources and contemporary gedolim. And what's interesting there is he kind of goes through different models and different sources and different chachamim of, wait a second, how do we exactly build that? Even in his own life, how did he build his hashkafic framework of going to Harvard for an advanced degree, a PhD in secular literature in Milton, and seeing where the chachamim fit in both historically in the Baalei Masorah of the Rishonim, but also in the contemporary context. But the idea that when we make decisions, we think about consulting both individually, but even if we don't consult them actually, consulting them from a value standpoint, our Chachmei HaMasorah. Rabbi Tov is saying to Ben Gurion, wait a second, let's take a step back. We are Jews. If we're going to talk about this kind of topic, where's the question going to go? It's not going to go to Jewish intellectuals. It's going to go to the Chachmei HaMasorah. So we can apply this in our own lives. When we think about what our pursuits are, what our vacations look like, when we make decisions in life, are our life decisions rooted in the Shofet Shebiyamecha? And whether it's an actual query or it's just a values-based question, but these ideas that rabbis Toaf are saying is, wait a second, let's be clear. Not every person who is Jewish and is wonderful, and we embrace them and we appreciate their contribution to Jewish history and to the Jewish world, it doesn't mean that they are the lodestar for our orientation and our values. And so we need to